Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody, for coming. You have to forgive me, this talk is not going to be very theoretical. Most of the computing I've reported on throughout my career has been decidedly applied, but there are a couple of points. And I sort of wanted to walk through both growing up in Silicon Valley a tiny bit and my working career and sort of take you through the backstories of about a half a dozen articles that I think sort of play on Silicon Valley, either sort of illuminating some point of evolution of the valley or talking about the impact of the technologies on Silicon Valley. But first, just, I've been fascinated for my entire career about why Silicon Valley. Why did it happen? Why does it persist? What sets it apart? This concept of centers of innovation is an interesting one. And, there are parallels, there are real parallels between periods of time, like the Renaissance. Florence was a place that was a center for a time. Vienna before World War II, and sort of Silicon Valley has some of those attributes. And the sort of question then is why? And there are a variety of, now there's a rich literature explaining sort of why Silicon Valley came into being and why it persists. But there are sort of a series of ideas I wanted to walk through. I mean, one of them is Frederick Terman, who was a dean of the engineering school, set up this thing called the Stanford Industrial Park in the 1950s. He wanted to make it, well, actually, no, earlier than that, but he wanted to make it so that his students didn't have to go east to work for big electronics corporations. And so he created this mechanism by which companies like Hewlett-Packard and Varian could attract talent. And that was interesting. I think that more importantly, there's been a set of books written focusing on how Silicon Valley is organized horizontally rather than vertically. And that's sort of that organizational structure of the valley, particularly a book called Regional Advantage by Anna Saxenians, who's a dean here at the Information School. It's one that sort of caught something that captures the structure of Silicon Valley. The way I see it is, people in the valley who work in the valley think that they work for the valley, not for a particular company. It's not a big deal to drive into a new driveway to go to work. But there's also a component of culture. And one of the remarkably different things about Silicon Valley than the rest of the world is that failure is not a badge of failure in Silicon Valley. Failure is actually a badge of honor, and that's a cultural distinction that's proved, I think, significant very early on with respect to Silicon Valley when it was competing against Route 128 as an innovation center. And then finally, my favorite is, well, not finally, but serendipity. Would Silicon Valley have come to exist if Shockley's mother, Shockley was the inventor of the transistor, was at Bell Labs, and when he came to set up Shockley Semiconductor, he came here because his mother was aging and he wanted to be closer to his mother. So he was, what if Shockley's mother was in Kansas? What would have happened? And in fact, it's actually even more interesting than that. It's just become clear from some research that a biographer of Gordon Moore has done, David Brock, is that Shockley actually wanted to build a robot company when he came to Silicon Valley. He was caught up in this sort of explosion of interest in automation in the early 1950s, and his original proposal was to build a manufacturing robot, and it kind of devolved into a transistor. So Silicon Valley's roots, in some sense, were actually perhaps in robotics. And then I've thought a lot about creativity, too, and why are some periods of time more creative than others? Silicon Valley sort of has this mythology that it's a center of innovation. It's always innovating. But in fact, the valley over a long period of time has been more and less innovative. And sometimes it's just engineering. And sometimes there's actually ideas that sort of break paradigms. And I explored this in a book that I wrote about 15 years ago called What the Dormouse Said, and sort of trying to understand why it was that the internet and personal computing industry emerged when they did, why they did. And they emerged in the context of this really chaotic period. The 1960s, there was a counterculture that was in some ways centered on the peninsula, and there was also an anti-war movement. It was a really chaotic time. And actually, so this is sort of my one sort of foray into theory. So it was pretty clear that when I was doing this reporting, that you couldn't really map a causal relationship between innovation and this counterculture that was emerging. So what was the relationship? I mean, for example, a lot of people have sort of made the argument that somehow psychedelic drug use is involved with creativity. And there was a lot of research of this in the 1960s when LSD was legal. The problem is sort of a causal one. Doug Engelbart, who invented the computer mouse, for example, invented the mouse before he took LSD as part of a creativity experiment. So that really doesn't work. So, but there was some research at the Santa Fe Institute that I've always been fascinated by. Doan Farmer and Chris Langton had this notion about creativity happening at the edge of chaos. And as a social scientist, that's always been an interesting argument to me. It was a really unusual period, and a lot of innovations, technical innovations, came out of there. I'm sort of in this community that sees our technologies as being socially constructed. And the personal computer industry, personal computing as a media, emerged where it did and when it did in Silicon Valley in the 1970s for a reason. So, I also grew up in Palo Alto. And so I just wanted to sort of walk through some of my influences in terms of my worldview. You know, Alan Kay, who's a well-known computer scientist, said, point of view is worth 80 IQ points. And my point of view was shaped during the 1960s and 1970s. And so this is, so if you look at that redwood tree in the back there, that's my parents' house. And if you look at this, this was called the Delamus, it still is called the Delamus Hacienda, Delamus Mansion. That bridge is actually hollow, and I played in that bridge when I was a kid. And it was on my paper route. And then about 10 years ago, it was bought by Larry Page, who is the CEO of Google. And aside from saying, there goes the neighborhood, I like to point out that the other house this is a half a block away, this is the house where Steve Jobs lived. And it's just richly ironic to me that I delivered papers to the two people who probably demonstrably did more to change the way news is delivered in the world than anybody else. But that's just parenthetically in passing. For me, this was sort of a world-changing event. This was a device that showed up in the Stanford Tressiter Coffee House in the fall of 1971. It was designed by two computer hackers who were hanging out around the Stanford AI laboratory.
What was the year?
1971. It was shortly before Nolan Bushnell, who of course gained fame from Pong, but he actually, before Pong, introduced another video game called Computer Space. This was actually just Space War, if you know your history of video games, which of course was the first video game, but it was also the first coin-operated arcade game. And if you went to Tressiter Union then and you put a dime on top of the machine, you could get in line to play. And I had never seen interactive television. This was a mind-blowing thing for me at that time. I think they borrowed money from their parents. They built it for $25,000, and it was actually built during the height of the Vietnam War, and so they couldn't call it Space War. They called it Galaxy Game, so it would be less threatening. And it actually stayed around in Tressiter for about 8 years. The next year, Stuart Brand, who was then a journalist, wrote an article where he described, for Rolling Stone magazine, where he described the space war culture, which was sort of cyberspace long before there was sort of cyberspace, and the technologies that were coming out of the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory and Xerox PARC, which would become basically the modern personal computer industry and the internet. So it was just starting to show up to be seen. You know, I was also hanging around Stanford AI Lab, and I had met the deputy director, and he was a man by the name of Les Ernest. And I was trying to get access to this news group called HumanNets, because HumanNets was a wonderful window and sort of a point of advantage for a reporter, because the people who were building the technologies, the engineers, were involved in an active internal discussion about what the social consequences of their technologies were. And so I went to Ernest's house, and he showed me basically how to get access to the internet, which is the ARPANET, long before there was an internet. The ARPANET was accessible openly at that point from NASA Ames. They had essentially an open dial-up that anybody could dial called the TIP. And if you could get to if you had a modem and you could get there, you could then get to a machine at MIT called MIT AI, and anybody who got there could get a free account and you could read HumanNets, and it was incredibly laborious. But it gave me this window that many people didn't have. Simultaneously, I stumbled across this book, which had a big influence on me. It was called The Micromillennium. It was written by Chris Evans. And basically, he made this argument that the microprocessor was going to transform society. This is circa 1976, 1977. That was really fascinating to me, and I sort of used it as a roadmap for my reporting for 2 or 3 decades. The point was that I realized that sooner than most, not that computers were getting cheaper and faster, That's not what it was about. It was that they were getting cheaper, faster, and faster, faster. That's what an exponential is about. And of course, it was that understanding that sort of shaped my view of Silicon Valley. And of course, all exponentials ultimately become S-curves, and we can talk about that at the very end. The other thing I ran across very early on was the Alto. A friend of mine was one of the kids who was writing code for Alan Kay. This is Alan Kay, a computer scientist who sort of had this idea in the 1960s of this computing. So Kay was important because Doug Engelbart, who did the original work on interactive computing, saw computing as sort of like, the computer was like this automobile that you drove through cyberspace. What Kay did that nobody else had done was he saw that computing was a dynamic media. The computing was the first sort of universal medium, this digital medium. And once you saw a Dynabook or an Alto, which was called an interim Dynabook, nothing was ever the same. And so I saw it probably in 1979. It was just a question of waiting for that kind of computing, which was about 5 years off with the introduction of the Macintosh in '84. And of course, also, the other thing I saw was this framing of these two laboratories at the very dawn of interactive computing on both sides of the Stanford campus. On one side was John McCarthy, who in 1962 came to Stanford and he set up the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Lab. He wanted to build these technologies that would displace humans. In his original ARPA proposal, he said that building a thinking machine would take about 10 years. That was in 1962. Same time, on the other side of campus, Doug Engelbart was working on what he called in 1962 intelligence augmentation, basically augmenting humans. And I noticed that this was this dichotomy, these two different philosophies, right at the dawn of interactive computing. And of course, they created these two communities, the AI community and what we've come to call the HCI, or Computers and Human Interaction Community. And they largely haven't spoken to each other in the intervening period. But they were there right from the beginning. And of course, Steve Jobs probably, as usual, said it best when he referred to personal computing as a bicycle for the mind. That sort of captured the spirit of intelligence augmentation, which Doug was talking about. So I was working as a young reporter after coming back from graduate school in the mid-1970s to late 1970s. I began to see that sort of life was imitating art. I was reading cyberpunk science fiction, and I was seeing that there were kids out there who were basically sort of bringing that science fiction to life. The book in particular, which is just a small novella written by Vernor Vinge, who was at the time a computer scientist mathematician at San Diego State University, noticed this subculture of kids. And he wrote True Names as an attempt to sort of explore the idea of what if you took this, what was called BBS culture at that time, and you added infinite computing and infinite bandwidth. What did you get? Well, you get a world in which you have to hide your true name at all costs. And it's still, I think it's held up very well, particularly about given what's going on with the DNC and the fake news crisis that's going on. It makes for very good reading. This was a story that I wrote in November of 1981. I bring it up now for two reasons. A modest claim, I believe this is the first article about cyber warfare. Or at least I haven't found an earlier example. And I also bring it up because it was about a math institute, which was the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis. The ARPANET, of course, was not a classified network, but it was at that point a military network. And it turned out that there was a backdoor from the ARPANET to the Kremlin with a 9600 baud modem. And when the Reagan administration found out about this, I think because of my article, they actually cut off funding to the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis for a while. This was this think tank in Austria that was entirely innocent. But I had somebody who worked at ARPA say to me, maybe we could settle it all with a giant computer space war game, which was more prophetic than I had any idea of at the time. Life was imitating art. So I showed up at the New York Times in 1988. I had been covering Silicon Valley for the San Francisco Examiner, and I became the IBM reporter because there were two technology writers there was one telecommunications writer in New York, and one IBM defined the computing industry at that point, and so I covered IBM. But shortly after I got there, it was pretty clear that this thing called the internet was emerging, and things began to change overnight. At that point, the internet was 50,000 computers. And about 3 days before the election, you can see the Democratic candidate there, the internet came to a halt. And it was really quite a chaotic time because it had just made the transition from being the ARPANET to the internet. And so there was this perception that maybe the US was under a military attack since this military network was being attacked. The first day's story by the Washington Post had 7 bylines. And I wrote my story, and the next day I came in. This was the first day story. Notice it's called A Virus. And it turns out the next day, which was Friday, somebody had called the New York Times national desk on a Friday morning, and they said that they knew the virus author, and they wanted to know what kind of trouble they were in. And because they referred to it as a virus, the call went to the medical reporter at the New York Times. And it took about 3 or 4 hours to sort this out, but ultimately I had a set of conversations with someone who referred to the author as Mr. X, and he wanted to know what kind of trouble he was in. Well, I had no clue what kind of trouble he was in because the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act had just been enacted, and who knew? Nobody had been convicted under it. So we had a set of back and forth conversations, and then at one point they made a small mistake. They referred to him as RTM instead of Mr. X. And so I knew enough Unix to realize, although I did not have a Unix account, that that was probably somebody's Unix login. So I called Cliff Stoll, who was a former Berkeley astronomer, now at the Center for Astronomical Studies in Harvard, and I said, Cliff, run finger. And back came the name Robert Tappan Morris. So I had a name. It was about 3 in the afternoon. I didn't really know what to do with it. That wasn't a story by itself. And then I got another call back. I'd made a whole bunch of calls in the beginning of the day, and somebody called me back from the National Security Agency. And I said, I think I know who wrote this program. And he said, who wrote it? And I kind of bridled, and I said, well, wait a minute, I'm not going to tell you. You're the computer police. Because remember, the NSA at that point had this dual role. They were the computer police, computer network police. And we went back and forth, and it was just this weird conversation, because he obviously knew more about what had happened than I did. And I was trying to figure this out. And finally, I blurted out, I think the author is Robert Tappan Morris. And he said, you're right. And so I was in this rush to get off the phone because I had a government source confirming this story. It was a good story. And I was about to hang up, and I said, wait, it's weird. Robert Tappan Morris, you have the same last name. You have the same name, Robert Morris. That's kind of weird. He said, it's not weird at all. It was my son. So Robert Morris turned out to be the chief scientist for the National Security Agency, which made it a much better story, obviously. It was also a story with kind of an interesting happy ending. This is Robert Morris, who went on to become a computer scientist at MIT, have an illustrious career, started several companies, and then was one of the founders of Y Combinator. In the back, that's his dad, Bob Morris, who was one of the original Unix design teams and a well-known cryptographer. What was important about this story, it was really the first point that the broader society had a sense of the impact of computer networks, both for good or bad. There had been things like the Source and CompuServe, but this was this moment where our view of computing really and networking completely changed. And I had not intended to have the computer cop beat. I was trying to get away from it. I was interested in technology and the impact of technology, but the cop beat was not what I wanted. I had friends calling me the Great White Virus Hunter, and I was trying to move away from things, but it just proved harder and harder as networks began to affect more and more of society. In 1993, I broke the story of the Clipper chip. And at that point, it seemed like a pretty straightforward conflict between privacy and surveillance and privacy rights. It seemed to me would have to dominate, because this world of commerce was going to come upon us very quickly. This is how many years later? 23 years later. I wrote the same story last year. The debate is back, and it'll be really interesting to see what this administration does with respect to encryption. Not clear yet. I moved back to California in 1992. I actually stopped being the internet reporter at the New York Times in 1992, which kind of dates me. And this was actually the very first article about the World Wide Web, December 7th, 1993. And I mention it because it's a case of getting it all right and all wrong at the same time. This is my lead. Think of it as a map to the buried treasures of the information age. And I have to confess that when I wrote Buried Treasures, I had come back, and one of the people I met with regularly was a researcher who worked at Digital Equipment's laboratory in Palo Alto, a man by the name of Brian Reed. And I got excited about the web when he basically made the claim to me that mid-career computer scientists could sort of relaunch their careers because the nature of publishing was being changed by this medium. And so when I wrote the word buried treasures, I was thinking information. I had no idea that I was really writing about treasure, and that within 2 years, the web would become Main Street for the entire world. And I would be run over by an absolute Mack truck as this little fringe beat I had on the side, which was computer networks, which nobody knew anything about. The New York Times did not have a clue about computer networks until Bill Gates showed up for an editorial lunch one day, and I think it would have been 90 or 91. And they said, how do you manage your company? He says, well, he said, I do it through email. And I said, what's email? And that became a front page story for the New York Times. But it all transformed very quickly. And by 1997, I don't know if you remember this, this may be way old history, but by 1997, if it wasn't for Monica Lewinsky, the press would have written about nothing but the internet. It just came to dominate the popular conversation. So once again, back to this BBS thing. This is a kind of a shaggy dog story. But sometimes stories sort of stick to the bottom of your shoe like gum. And for me, I stumbled into this world of BBSs very early. There was actually an interesting one in the midst of the computer hobbyist area called 8BBS. It was actually a homebrew bulletin board system designed by a DEC technician who had an apartment in Santa Clara on El Camino. And he brought a PDP-8 computer home, and he wrote his own BBS software. And the trick was, you had one modem attached to it, and so one person at a time can use it. And if you can imagine a 300 baud modem, that's sort of like makes watching grass grow fast. And so what happened was, and Bernard Klatt, the guy who built this, had a real deep belief in freedom of information. And so his point was you could post anything on his bulletin board. And it turns out that a subculture of young kids who were sort of at that dividing point between phone freaks and computer hackers inhabited his bulletin board and began to play around. And at one point, some of the kids who were frustrated with things being slow sent him a 1200 baud modem because that was so modern you could get on and off 4 times as fast. And it wasn't long because the kids bought that modem with a stolen credit card that an interagency task force of something like 7 agencies and broke down the door of Bernard's apartment because he was in Canada on vacation and took his bulletin board system away forever. And that was the first BBS bust, a story I wrote for a little computer newspaper called InfoWorld in probably 1982. But through that, I met this interesting sort of subculture of people who were at that cusp of sort of exploring these new networks which were starting to emerge. And one of them was this woman, a kind of an odd woman by the name of Susan Headley. Her online name was Susan Thunder. She was a phone freak who had turned into a computer hacker. And she was part of this group that was called the Roscoe Gang. This is Roscoe. He was a young programmer who met at a pizza parlor in Southern California. And I watched this sort of an online war play out between Roscoe and Susan Thunder and this sort of overweight teenager who sort of thought he was living in a spy movie. His name was Kevin Mitnick. And I sort of stumbled across Kevin Mitnick for the first time in the late 1970s and continued to write about his exploits on and off until he was arrested in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina in 1995. He had this knack of repeatedly getting in trouble. Between the first time I met him and when he was finally arrested by the FBI in Raleigh-Durham in 95, he was arrested 6 times. And he got in more and more trouble over the years. In the beginning, it was fun. This group would do things like take over the telephone systems of various locales. It turns out there was a backdoor in 4 ESS switches, which are used by the telephone network, that they sort of took advantage of. They would take over the operator function, and they would answer phone calls, and they'd say, we have both black and white directories. Do you know what color they are? Or they would say, the number is 4578 5.5. Do you know how to dial the half? And it was sport. And they were exploring this world that was pretty much unrestricted. This hacker culture was emerging. Ultimately, in 1988, Kevin, who couldn't seem to put this down, was arrested by a judge who had seen the movie War Games. And she decided that it was probably a possibility that if Kevin had a phone access in prison, he could start World War III, so she didn't want to let him make a phone call. Finally, they convinced her that hacking was an addiction, and he was sentenced to a halfway house with drug addicts for his term. And during that same period, I met this man who was the person who ultimately tracked Kevin Mitnick down. And you meet people in your career. This is Tsutomu Shimomura, and he was one of the most interesting people I've ever met. His backstory is just extraordinary. He grew up in Princeton. His father was a molecular biologist, organic chemist, and he was thrown out of junior high school at age 12, but the psychologist at Princeton let him take over the care and feeding of their departmental computer. He was thrown out of high school at age 16, but he became the system administrator for the VAX that the astrophysicists had at Princeton. But I guess this was 14 years. He was 14 years old when he was thrown out. When he was 16, the astrophysicists decided that Tsutomu should go to college, even though he had been thrown out of high school. And so they sent him to Caltech, where he entered, and he took Feynman's course on the physics of computation. He got bored with Caltech after 2 years, and he ended up getting a postdoc at Los Alamos, youngest postdoc since Feynman, actually. And he did actually important early work in a parallelization of CFD problems while he was at Los Alamos. And then he got interested in computer security. And I met him when he was doing computer security research. He'd followed a professor to the San Diego Supercomputer Center, and he was spending his time there. And I used him as a source for a number of years. He was involved sort of deeply in the computer security side, and he was classic first example of a white hat hacker. He'd built his own homebrew tools. For example, he discovered early on that a cell phone made by the Oki phone company was actually pretty much a great scanner too. And rather than doing anything with this, he went before Congress and testified about it. And if you go back and read Wired magazine issue number 1, volume number 1, I have a profile of him and another friend and sort of their activities and what they were doing. And I kept him hidden for a long time until a really strange set of events happened involving Kevin Mitnick. And I bring it up now because that was the moment, I think, that we sort of, as a society, reached that point of end of trust of networks. And Kevin was instrumental in making that happen, because what he did was, he wasn't technical. He was a con man. He was a really world-class social engineer who could talk people out of information over the phone. And what he did was he exploited people's best qualities, so the desire to help someone, to basically compromise the information of the systems that they protected. He did it with great skill. And a very strange set of events happened in 1994. I'd sort of forgotten about Kevin. And then I had written a book called Cyberpunk with Katie Hafner, which documented sort of the activities of 3 young people, including Kevin, who had broken into systems and gotten in trouble. And I was invited down to Qualcomm to give a talk about this book. I didn't really know why. And at the end, they said, somebody stole the source code for our next generation cell phone. And we had the FBI in here, and they told it was Kevin Mitnick. And I said, oh, that's interesting. And as I began to look around, I realized that there were 3 police agencies chasing Kevin, and he'd managed to stay a foot ahead of them. And that led to this story. There was a wonderful incident where he was running this scam with the DMV where he would get information from the DMV by posing as a police officer and then have it faxed to a copy shop. The police staked out the copy shop to catch Kevin. And he managed to, as they closed in on him, throw the papers in the air and run off and hop over a fence, and they didn't catch him. So it was a good story, and it would have ended there, except that in I guess it was December of 1994, someone broke into Tsutomu's home and stole a bunch of his tools. And Tsutomu had an unusual computing environment at his home. He had a 56 kilobit line, which was high speed at that point, from the San Diego supercomputer to the 11 Sun workstations that he had in his apartment in San Diego. And somebody sort of pilfered a bunch of his tools. And so at this point, what he did was he wrote a technical paper on the nature of the attack, because it was an interesting attack. It was called the SynFlood attack. And he gave this paper, and I wrote a profile of him. And at that point, the New York Times was not online. And so after the paper dropped on somebody's porch on a Friday evening, they called me and said, that guy you wrote about, Tsutomu Shimomura, I just found a bunch of his files on this computer called The Well. What are they doing there? We don't know why they were there. And so Tsutomu basically, for a while, put the problem off. He was skiing in the mountains, and he had his graduate student come up and look at the well. And it turned out the well was owned by whoever was the 14,000 people who were using that system basically were under the control of some kind of an outside entity. And so Tsutomu showed up. He was deputized by the USAG in San Francisco, a man by the name of Kent Walker is now Google's chief legal officer. And he basically had this sort of ringside seat while he chased Kevin for a little over a week. And what was striking about Tsutomu, for me as someone who has ADD, is he had this ability to concentrate on problems for really extended periods of time. I'd never seen an intelligence like this, to just sit and focus on one problem, which was very striking to me. And it took him about a week. He would move from system to system. He was very interested in timing information. He used timing information essentially to track Kevin down. And on a Friday night, he called me and said, and this was Tsutomu's way of talking, I think I'm within tactical nuclear distance. And he was flying to Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, and I jumped on a plane and followed him. And I ended up there on a Sunday evening at about midnight in a telco security van or technical van near a cell site in suburban Raleigh-Durham. And I got into the van, and there was a voice that I recognized, which was really kind of weird. There was this conversation going on, and somebody was giving somebody public relations advice on being in trouble. One voice I didn't recognize. The other voice I was pretty sure was a guy by the name of Eric Corley, who ran an underground computer hackers magazine called 2600. And so the telco guys notified the FBI, and it took them about 2 days. Tsutomu at that point had a pocket computer and a cellular modem, and he used it kind of as a direction finder. And we got that evening to within about 100 yards of Kevin's apartment. The FBI came in with much more advanced equipment, and 2 days later, they knocked on Kevin's door, and he was so freaked out that he actually threw up when they arrested him. And we saw him the next morning like this in a gray sweatsuit with ankle chains. And I had tried to see Kevin like 15 years before in juvenile hall. And so I'd actually never met him. I talked to him on the phone. And he was arraigned in this courthouse before anybody knew that he was arrested. And as he walked out, I walked up to him. And so this would not have been a great story, even though there was lots of sort of chasing and stuff like that, without Kevin's participation. And what happened was, I walked up and I said, Kevin, I hope things go well for you. And he looked at me, you could tell he hated me. I was the bad guy. But he turned to Tsutomu and he said, Tsutomu, I respect your skills. And when I wrote that story originally, I wrote that as the kicker, and my editor, who understands how these things work, moved it up to the front page of the New York Times. And so this made this story, this grand sort of conflict between a white hat and a black hat hacker, that it wouldn't have been if Kevin hadn't have said that. I still don't think he understands that to this day, that he made the story. And so the next day I tried to get home. I read the story. I was a little disappointed by it. And there were still sort of loose ends. It was kind of a mystery. There had been people who were cooperating with him. There was a guy by the name of JSZ, Jonathan Sanderson Zimmerman, because Kevin was not technical, but somebody had written the attack tools to get into Tsutomu's machine. And that was kind of a curious thing. JSZ was an Israeli graduate student, it turned out, and for a long time I wondered whether this wasn't sort of a foreign government's way of getting access to next generation cellular telephone software. Probably not. I got home after I flew across the country, and there were literally 27 calls from Hollywood studios, we counted, and 3 television trucks outside of my house. So it was sort of one of those moments that perturbs the universe. And there was a bit of a mystery. After he was arrested, Kevin was arrested, Tsutomu got a series of threatening voicemails.
Sent December 27th at 4:33 p.m.
Have you? My technique is the best. My boss is the best. And you? I know artist technique. I know Sendale technique. And my style is much better. Don't you know who I am? Me and my friends will kill you.
That was a death threat.
Hey, boss, your kung fu is really good.
here's another one.
Sent December 30th at 2:35 p.m.
Totomo, my learned disciple, I see you put my
There's a
voice
Newsweek
on
article now,
Newsweek.
so it's
You put it on
getting to
Newsweek.
be a
You
big
put it
deal.
on the net. Don't you know that my Kung Fu is the best? My Kung Fu is great. Why you put my voice on the net? This is not good. Haven't I not taught you, grasshopper? You must learn from the master. I know all the techniques and styles. I know tiger claw style. I know crane technique. I know crazy monkey technique. And I also know artist and mail. And you put my voice on the net, I'm very disappointed, my son. Sorry again, just Tomo, my son. I just want to tell you, very important. All these phone calls you received with making reference to Kung Fu movies, nothing to do with any computer thing whatsoever. Just a little interesting call. I see now that this is getting too big, way too big. I want to tell you, my son, that these have nothing to do with any computer activities whatsoever. Just making fun of Kung Fu movies. That's it. Making reference to, they're trying to make a reference to putting Kung Fu movies into a computer reference. That's it. Nothing to do with any Mitnick hacking, anything. Nothing.
Nobody knew Mitnick was arrested by then.
That's it. All coincidence. This is getting too big, and nothing wrong has been done by anybody who left any messages on your voicemail. Just to let you know.
One last one.
Oh, my friend, I just want to reiterate, it is a big joke. This big make fun of Kung Fu movie have nothing to do with computer hacking, Mitnick, nothing. You tell me, do not send them to come and get me. No, do not fly out to come and get me. I'm not worth it. Just make fun of Kung Fu movies.
So, in the wake of this, I had become the bad guy because, America has, as a society, we have a love affair with outlaws, and Kevin was the quintessential outlaw. We have Bonnie and Clyde and Butch Cassidy, and so ultimately 3 books were written. I wrote one with Tsutomu, and there were 2 other books, and there was a very bad movie. You can see it on Netflix if you want, although I don't recommend it. And that's a long story in itself that I won't go into. I began getting death threats. There was one from a kid in Stockton that said, in part, "I want to see you die a horrible death." And I gave that to the New York Times security people, and they contacted the Stockton Police Department. And it took about 3 hours. The detective was just in love with this story because usually what he dealt with was stolen cars, and here he had cybercrime, which was just a big deal at that time. And so he found the kid who was a minor, and so nothing happened. Tsutomu was vilified too, but he went on to start several other companies, and he's still active doing sort of technology stuff. What is striking, I told you about his ability to concentrate. And about 5 years ago, Tsutomu's father was awarded the Nobel Prize for the discovery of the green fluorescent protein, the green fluorescent protein. And what struck me, and what's still remarkable, his father gave a lecture, his Nobel Prize lecture, at Sandia, at Los Alamos, where Tsutomu had worked. And he talked about sort of the key breakthrough that he had made when he was working on this. And he talked about sitting and thinking about one thing for an entire month, and how he had just focused. And it struck me that there was this really, is it something that he inherited? Is it something he learned? There's a relationship in the type of intelligence they had that I just found was fascinating, that the father and son had that linkage. So anyway, I continued to try to get away from computer security reporting, and ultimately I succeeded. After Anonymous and LizSec in 2011, I decided that if I had to deal with one more testosterone-poisoned teenager with an attitude, I was going to have an aneurysm, and I needed to do something else. It was time to leave. It had become like Groundhog Day. It was the best story imaginable. It's still a front-page story, but I needed to walk away from it because I had written the same story too many times. I began in 1996. John Perry Barlow wrote this article in Wired, which was called "The Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace," which talked about this idea that there would be this utopian abode that would be separate from the grimy physical world. And I was in that community who was, I really was sort of a utopian when I started out. And I've come pretty much 180 degrees and become at least a realist and maybe something of a pessimist about networks and whether we'll ever have security and privacy. But there were also there were more fun things to do. And
once again, this is the first vehicle.
this was
May not be first place, so please take that into consideration.
I began covering our DARPA's Grand Challenges, which started in 2004, and this was what happened the next year in 2005. And it was, DARPA had sort of decided that the military was not making fast enough progress towards self-driving, and so they came up with this notion of letting anybody in. And the first year, 2004, there were great failures, but this was 18 months later. This is Stanley. And it was actually a pretty exciting race. It looks like, they're going pretty slow, but if you were following this thing while it was happening, and CMU was leading until the last moment, and then the Stanford car passed the CMU car when the CMU car had a breakdown. It was a very kind of exciting thing to write about. And of course, AI now had begun to make progress after failing for so many years. And plus, as a story to report on, there's absolutely nothing better than being in an accident in a self-driving car as a reporter and being able to walk away to report about it. That's Sebastian Thrun, and that was that same car while it was being tested in the Arizona desert about 4 or 5 months before. And Stanley would go on to win a $2 million prize, but it was interesting to watch Sebastian and his team during that period when it was not at all certain what would happen. And of course, I guess it was 5 years later, I broke the story of the Google car, which has an interesting backstory. Remember, they were driving these cars on public roads for half a year and nobody noticed. And I think that the simple reason why is that they also had Street View cars, which had a mast on top of them. They were driving these cars largely at night, and so they were not very noticeable, but they were out there in the wild. And Sebastian Thrun, who had been a Stanford professor and then went on to start Google X, had sort of spilled the beans a little bit in Alaska at an AI conference. And so I'd heard this idea that Google was driving self-driving cars on public roads. How could that be? That had to be illegal. And then I got this story in a really interesting way. I was at a Christmas party at my cousin's house, and his son said, this kid I went to high school with at Menlo Atherton is being paid $15 by Google an hour to sit in a car, but he's not driving. I said, oh, really? And I went to Sebastian and confronted him, and ultimately, it was a really an interesting moment because I realized the game I had grown up playing, which was about getting scoops on new technologies and products. At that point, I realized it was kind of over, and this is why I'd fought with Google for a number of years, and I was the first one to report that Google was making a lot of money. They had hid that bit of information for a long time. And my relationship with Larry Page had been sort of damaged over this. He saw me as an enemy. And Eric Schmidt had actually broken my exclusives from time to time by calling the AP and giving stories away that I was about to break. And so we'd had a difficult relationship. But in this case, they collaborated with me. But what I realized when this story ran, Google waited until my story was put online, but then they put up their own blog post. And so all of my competitors, this was sort of the first time this really sort of came home to me. All of my competitors didn't have to sort of point to my story. They could point to Google. And so the ability to get an exclusive really had changed in that world. And that's just one of many things that got disrupted by the internet. I also was sort of, over a long period of time, our society at sort of decade-and-a-half intervals has gotten anxious about automation and its impact on society. And as I watched machine learning begin to have an impact and began writing on it, I was sort of part of that process that created this new wave of anxiety. And I was actually in that camp of people who sort of had their hair on fire about, Moshe Vardi, for example, is a Rice computer scientist who's made a name for himself going around saying no human jobs left that machines won't be able to do by 2045. That's the kind of sort of anxiety thing. And I was in that camp. This was a story I wrote about e-discovery software and the impact it's having on the legal profession. And I think that what we saw then, for the first time, computing was having an impact not just on blue-collar jobs, but it was having an impact both on unskilled and skilled white-collar jobs. And so it was a period of, lawyers and doctors were being displaced perhaps for the first time. And I was in that crowd until I had a conversation with this man, Danny Kahneman. And I've really come completely 180 degrees the other direction. And the reason why, I had my hair on fire, and I was making the argument to him that manufacturing robotics would come to China, and there would lead to disruption. And he stopped me. He said, "You don't get it." He said, "In China, they'll be lucky if the robots come just in time." I said, "What? Excuse me?" This was just sort of this totally. And he walked me through the demography of modern China. And when I began to look at it, I realized that most people look at snapshots. They don't look at sort of dynamic systems. And the fact is, for example, in China, in the last year, the working age workforce declined by 5 million people. So it's not only the number of workers is shrinking and is not going to change dramatically anytime soon, but more importantly, the dependency ratio is growing. That is the ratio between the people who can give care and people who need care in society. Last year, for the first time in history, there were more people in the world who are over 65 than under 5. That's a big deal, and it's only going to get dramatically different. It's changed everywhere in the developed world with the exception of Africa already. And so, and there are lots of reasons. When I talk to people who have their hair on fire about automation, I point out that there are now more people working in the United States than ever in history, 143 million people. So you would expect that if things are going to fall off a cliff, that we would start to see that. We haven't seen it yet. So I just want to make the argument that it's more nuanced than people see. This is sort of Silicon Valley's view of the world, up and to the right, exponentials. But exponentials always turn into S-curves. That's one thing. And the other thing that I think is so dramatic, so you see this great increase in computing power, and yet here's what's happened to productivity growth, the rate of productivity change. So how can those two things be true? Robert Solow, the economist, pointed out in the 1980s this Solow paradox, the paradox of increased computers. He said, computers are everywhere except in productivity statistics. And so it's obviously a more nuanced relationship than productivity does not fall directly out of increasing computer power. And then the other thing is that the valley, in terms of sort of what has kept the valley alive, the valley really is at the end of that period defined by Moore's law. Maybe not forever, but it's clearly in abeyance. And just 4 points. I used to be told that we were going to reach exascale computing, the next generation of supercomputing, in 2018. Now that's been pushed back to 2023 at the earliest. Intel had this wonderful process it called tick-tock, where they would shrink and then they would introduce a new architecture, shrink, introduce, for a long, long time, over 20 years. And last year they failed. They fell off the tick-tock paradigm in trying to get to 10 nanometers. And so that process has slowed down. There's this wonderful thing called dark silicon. It turns out in modern microprocessors, you have to throttle them all the time. If you turned on all the transistors, they would melt. And so you can't effectively use all the transistors simultaneously. So that's sort of Moore's law goodness gone. But the thing about this chart that I think is sort of most significant, and I think is the biggest deal, is that the cost of individual transistors stopped falling 2 years ago. And falling cost of transistor was the free ride that all the upper layers of the stack got to take advantage of for 50 years, basically. And if that's no longer true, you get into this other regime. It's not to say that it's the end of innovation, it's the end of the free ride. And I was at a conference a couple of years ago on computer architecture, and at the end I had dinner with a young computer architect, David Brooks, and he was just totally beside himself because basically he was enjoying the fact that this free ride is over because now the architects could make a difference. And in particular with GPUs, and so it's clear that innovation is still around, but it may not be like turning a crank and getting this free ride. Sort of in looking at Silicon Valley, just a couple of sort of concluding thoughts. This is Richard Florida is a social scientist who did this wonderful study that I think is just amazing, and he sort of geolocated the center of Silicon Valley. This is a year and a half ago, but today by venture capital investment. So the center of Silicon Valley has moved from Santa Clara to San Francisco. Actually, the foot of Potrero Hill, to be precise, is the center of Silicon Valley, as the valley went from being a manufacturing center to a design and marketing center. And so somebody then reverse engineered this and went back and looked for the center of Silicon Valley in 1984 by using those Thomas map guides. Remember those Thomas map guides? Well, probably many of you don't remember them, but anyway, we used to use them as maps. And it turns out the center of Silicon Valley in 1984 was in Santa Clara, and what's there today is a storage locker. And the reason it's a storage locker is it's also a toxic waste dump because there was a fab there, and you can't put a housing there. You have to put. I guess the final thing I wanted to say is I've thought a lot about when it's over, when Silicon Valley ends. And for me, in terms of getting what made Silicon Valley, there were two moments that I sort of got it about Silicon Valley. The first one was in 1982. I was at a meeting of something called the Big Blue Computer Club. The personal computer, the IBM PC had just come out. And there was this huge crowd of guys in white, all white shirts, and they actually had pocket protectors because that was the culture of the time. And this San Jose Mercury reporter got up on stage, and she interviewed them all. And at one point she said, how many of you are planning on starting your own companies? And 2/3 of the hands went up. Everybody thought in that audience thought they were one good idea away from being Steve Jobs. And that was a culture. And the culture had emerged in 1982, and it was in full flower. At the same time, 2 years later, I walked into a bakery in Sunnyvale and realized it was an Indian bakery. And it was an Indian bakery because there was a community of Indian disk drive engineers there. And I got this sense of Silicon Valley as a magnet for the best and brightest for the whole world. So the question is, will that maintain itself? In 2006, I was spending a lot of time in Europe, and it really looked like mobile innovation was happening first in Europe and not here, and that the sort of the center of innovation for the next platform was about to move to Europe. And then the iPhone was introduced, and everything reset, and we took the next generation of platforms, stayed in Silicon Valley. Last year, I went to Beijing for the first time in a long time, and it really felt that in Beijing, Silicon Valley has infected China with an entrepreneurial frenzy. The numbers are striking. Last year, there were 4 million startups in China, 1.7 million of them were tech. And I really have this feeling that, which I've been exploring and trying to understand the degree to which there is an independent AI technology in China that's happening outside of the US, which is still an open question, but it's clear that China is not going to be a fast follower or be a competitor. And maybe the large-scale sort of arc of technology innovation leads from east to west. That's been argued by French social scientists. It starts in Europe, it passed from the East Coast to the West Coast, and maybe it's just on its way to Asia. Thank you very much. If there are questions, I'll be glad to answer them. Sure.
I have a question on this understanding Silicon Valley on the income inequality. Did you think about this in Silicon Valley?
Yeah. So.
You didn't have this.
Yeah.
It wasn't part of your talk.
Well, it's not, and yet actually, if you look. There is an argument, the impact of these valley technologies on income inequality. And this is an argument that's been made that one of the consequences of this next wave of technology has been to exacerbate income inequality. And I can kind of see it. I mean, President Obama sort of got in trouble in 2011 for arguing that ATMs had destroyed the bank teller position. And it turns out that he sort of missed it. That's not what's happened. Because of the falling cost of computing and communications, banks can now put branches on every street corner. There's as many banks as there are Starbucks, and banks want human-facing tellers. And so they're actually, the number of tellers, while we've had this great wave of technology, has stayed constant. That's a reasonable sort of lower-end middle-class job. But what happened that he didn't see is in the back offices of banks, and actually many modern corporations, like a neutron bomb has gone off. All of those jobs that involved, there were white-collar, sort of lower-skilled, unskilled jobs are gone. And they're never coming back as just simply the interconnection of networks has happened. So I think that, Keynes may still be right. Jobs are destroyed but not work. But if in fact you take knowledge out of the equation, and I think that's a design question, we can design people in, we can design people out. But if you design people out, you're de-skilling, and that will exacerbate potentially the spread of income distribution in society.
Do you think in hindsight, like Silicon Valley could have been more involved in politics?
Well, I don't know about so politics. I mean, the Valley is.
A political issue or something.
Yeah, and in the Clinton administration, actually, it's interesting. If you look over time, it hasn't always gone in the same direction. Probably what is it? Is it 15, 20 years ago? The United States had a period of lessening of income inequality, and it's accelerated recently. But whenever I get into any of these issues, you find that finding a single cause is much more difficult than it would seem at the outset. So I mean, people have suggested technology is a factor, but it could be many other things. Taxation could play a role. Jerry Kaplan, who's a friend who's an early AI pioneer in Silicon Valley, sort of was trying to deal with this question, and his first sort of solution was, well, let's just make it illegal for corporations to own robots. Only individuals can own robots, and then you'd be able to extract the labor from your robot. It was a nice idea, but totally impractical. But he's been thinking about it, and more recently he's thought about the idea, what if you could, probably not in the next 4 years, but what if you could introduce legislation that would encourage or induce corporations to spread ownership more broadly? That's kind of a non-regulatory approach to the problem that would be interesting. Give people incentives for broadening the distribution of ownership of their companies. Yes?
So what if we get away from an income tax on people and have a value-added tax on all value-added, whether by robots or otherwise?
So
this is Martin Ford's thesis in a
yeah,
couple of books.
yeah. No, I know it's been bubbling up. I just don't. I feel like I'm out of my league on tax policy and what are the second-order effects. Aren't there value-added taxes in Europe in
Yes.
significant ways? Yeah. So.
How well are they doing? I was joking, I said, and how well are they doing?
Yes.
So I had this question, is technology really bringing the world together? It's a vague question. Or, recently you've seen that technology is used to isolate yourself from the others.
Yeah.
So for me, it was always like, I do something good, technology is a tool to, everybody sees everybody, but it's right now the opposite is happening. People isolate themselves and just listen to their own propaganda, and then, I don't know.
And it may be sort of culturally relative too. I did some reporting on a Microsoft experiment, not here with these conversational agents. I mean, in the United States, every conversational agent turns into a porn bot. I mean, that says something about our culture. In China, this experiment called Xiaoice, Little Bing, Siri is designed to be a productivity tool. It's designed to understand you, answer a question, or do a task. Xiaoice was designed to have an extended conversation with you. And they have it was a very successful experiment with millions of young Chinese using this system and having multiple, like 60 interactions in a day. They call it toilet time. The kids would go into the bathroom late at night to converse with this program. And this is like, it feels creepy to us. It feels like it's right out of her. 25% of the people who used Xiaoice texted "I love you" to it. 50% texted "thank you." So there's this kind of anthropomorphic thing going on. The people in Redmond were freaked out about this, but I talked to an IBM researcher who was Chinese, and she said, it's culturally different. In China, her argument was that people were in such tight sort of contact, face-to-face contact with each other all the time, that they were using this program as a way to get private space. So it maybe didn't have kind of the dark, creepy connotation that you would think, at least in an American sense, of being disintermediated. Yeah.
You spoke about cybersecurity. What do you see as the future of protecting data, either from the hardware or software side?
So, I wrote about this both as a technology and as an industry as RSA began to explode during the last 2 decades. This is the trade show. And it was just always striking to me is this RSA convention would get bigger every year. The industry would grow larger, and computer security would get demonstrably worse. And that was one of the reasons I gave up, is I saw no easy solution to these problems, as has been demonstrated by the DNC hacks and and related things in the last year. I'm very pessimistic. I mean, there is a school, the Start Over School. There's a DARPA-funded project called Clean Slate, basically start over secure systems. But, there's this trade-off between convenience and security. And we've made this trade-off in favor of convenience. And you have a system where the weakest link is the human being. And what do you do when the problem is like somebody puts a gun to their head and pulls the trigger many times? How do you protect people from themselves? I didn't see a way out of that. So I'm prepared to have my mind changed, but yes.
So Silicon Valley started because of all kinds of good factors came together in this valley, right? Easy credit, good technically skilled workforce and education. Now because network has permeated, do you think there will be a localization, or do you think there's...
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm looking at that. So my way of testing your hypothesis is, when will the first major IT platform emerge from somewhere else besides Silicon Valley? And I keep looking. I thought it was going to happen in 2006. I thought that mobile computing would emerge and it would be centered in Europe, and I was wrong. So I guess if I was going to ask that question today and try to test it as a hypothesis, my guess is the next choke point or platform is around IoT stuff. That would be my guess. And so who will lead the IoT? That's where I would look for an answer to that question. Yes?
Back in 2000, as coincidentally, as the administration changed, there was a dot-com bust. Is there another coincidence in that, about to happen?
Oh, is there? Well, so I've been through at least 5 cycles in my career, and my argument would be, why should this one be any different? I mean, this, going all the way back to gold mining in San Francisco, this has been a boom and bust economy. So the question is not when, it's sort of why and how. And that's a fascinating question. What will trigger the next reset? But how could it not? And if you look at traffic on 101 and 280, we're clearly at actually, I've been trying to call bubble tops, for a long time, and there was this period, it's now a year and a half or 2 years ago, I think it was a Salesforce convention, where people were literally shooting $2 bills out of guns. And I thought, this has to define a bubble top. This is irrational behavior, but we've gone. There was a wave of Chinese investment, venture investment that came in, and so there's, the Valley has this ability to sort of set itself. And I was looking a while ago, and social media venture capital investment peaked in 2011 at 1.8 billion. And in October, when I checked, it had fallen to 10 million for the year. And at that point, they were forecasting that AI machine learning investment in the Valley would peak at 1.8 billion. I think it's past that now. So the Valley swarms on things, and and there's a huge amount of investment. And so as long as there's venture investment, things, there is no reality. Yeah.
You never mentioned why they stole Tsutomu's tools.
So I believe the reason is, you'll have to ask Kevin that question, or they. That's also a good question. But I believe that Kevin felt that if he had access to that source code, he used the tools to get the source code. He was after the source code. The source code would allow him to be invisible in a cellular network. And the fact was, he was wrong. He wasn't invisible. He was very visible. So, yeah.
So in the HBO show, Silicon Valley, there's this recurring joke where every startup, they have this mission to make the world a better place, like scalable database technologies to make the world a better place or something. So have you seen that in Silicon Valley? And how far back does that go? Is that something new? And is it authentic?
I think it's relatively new. I think it emerged more in the 1980s. It emerged with the personal computer industry. People like Steve Jobs sort of had this sort of higher notion about their mission, that it was not just market driven. I don't know what to. I mean, so I've been asking this question, particularly about AI. Because we now have this industry association. We have many, many organizations, but AI for Good, where the 5 largest AI companies have banded together, and 2 or 3 of them said that we're not AI companies, we're IA companies. And are those marketing sentiments, or are they real? For some of the technologists who I know well, I believe they're very real. It's heartfelt belief. But where the rubber will hit the road is in how they deploy these systems for their customers, whether they be. And it's a complex question. For example, a call center. so Microsoft is developing technology, conversational agents to do call center-like tasks. So you have a choice. Do you replace the call center operator, or do you make better call center operators? That's a technology design question. I'm dying to see what they do. The same thing's true with Watson, IBM's effort. Do you basically make smarter doctors, or do you make smarter physicians' assistants? And that's a social question that I don't think there's a clear answer to, right? I mean, the cost of medical care is one of the hottest issues in those. So, but I mean, you ought to be able to establish metrics and see what they're doing.
Speaking of administration, what's your take on about this so-called post-fact world and alternative facts?
Yeah. Well, so I guess I would say that this is not new. The notion of yellow journalism is as old as newspapers. I worked for the Hearst Corporation. And people have lived inside filter bubbles for a long, long time. I mean, in Europe, you tend to pick your party affiliation and you read the newspaper of your party. So I don't think anything's new here. What is striking is the way this administration is using it as a weapon, and it's chosen to paint the news organizations of the country as the, quote, enemy of the people. I mean, the language itself is quite striking. It's highly politicized. And I don't know how it'll end. I mean, you could imagine a lot of really bad scenarios.
Well,